All right, it looks like we've got a pretty stable group. I'm sure we'll be joined by some more friends as time goes on, but at this point I'd like to invite Hillwood's director, Kate Marker, to come on and introduce tonight's program.
Well, good evening. I'm Kate Marker. I'm Executive Director at Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for inviting us into your homes this evening. As we begin, I'd like to take a moment to gratefully acknowledge the Nacotchtank, also documented as the Anacostan, Piscataway, and Pamunkey, the native peoples on whose ancestral lands Hillwood stands, as well as the diverse and vibrant native communities that make their home near us today. I know that many of us are Hillwood members, and I appreciate your ongoing support. For those of you who are not yet members, I invite you to join and support Hillwood's ongoing scholarship, exhibitions, and public programming. I hope to see many of you at upcoming programs at Hillwood. On Tuesday, November 16th, speakers Dr. Elizabeth Rule and Dr. Wilfred Zeisler will talk about Hillwood, a history of this land. The program will be hybrid. You can choose to attend on-site at Hillwood and enjoy a glass of wine with friends at the reception, remember that? Or watch it live streamed via Zoom. Please help us spread the word near and far about what I expect will be a fascinating talk about the history of those who have cared for the land on which Hillwood stands, from the native peoples of the DC region to Marjorie Merriweather Post and her staff. This season is truly a wonderful time to visit Hillwood, with beautiful fall gardens and two incredible special exhibitions. Roaring Twenties, The Life and Style of Marjorie Merriweather Post, and Christine May's Rich Soil are on view until early January. We're open Tuesday through Sunday, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. I want to now share a few practical reminders about tonight's virtual lecture. Your cameras and microphones are off, so please make yourself comfortable. We still want to hear from you. Please say hello and tell us where you are viewing from using the chat. And finally, submit your questions using the Q&A module, which is separate from the chat, as they cross your mind. We will get to as many questions as we can at the end of the program. Tonight, we explore the relationship between Parisian fashion, culture, and society in the 1920s with Valerie Steele, who last spoke at Hillwood in 2015, and we are so happy to welcome back. Valerie is the director and chief curator at the Museum of the Fashion Institute of Technology, where she has organized more than 24 exhibitions since 1997, including The Corset, Fashioning the Body, Gothic, Dark Glamour, A Queer History of Fashion from the Closet to the Catwalk, Pink, The History of a Punk, Pretty, Powerful Color, and Paris, Capital of Fashion. She's also the author or editor of more than 25 books, including Paris Fashion, Women of Fashion, Fetish, Fashion, Sex, and Power, The Corset, The Berg Companion to Fashion, and Fashion Designers A through Z, the collection of the museum at FIT. Her books have been translated into Chinese, French, German, Italian, Portuguese, Russian, and Spanish. In addition, she is the founder and editor-in-chief of Fashion Theory, the Journal of Dress, Body, and Culture, the first scholarly journal in fashion studies. Paris, Capital of Fashion, is available at Hillwood's shop. Valerie combines serious scholarship and a Yale PhD, with the rare ability to communicate with general audiences. As author, curator, editor, and public intellectual, Valerie Steele has been instrumental in creating the modern field of fashion studies and in raising awareness of the cultural significance of fashion. She has appeared on many TV programs, including The Oprah Winfrey Show and Undressed, The History of Fashion. Described in the Washington Post as one of fashion's brainiest women, and by Susie Menkes as the Freud of fashion, she has been consistently listed as one of the people shaping the global fashion industry in the Business of Fashion 500 since 2014. Valerie, I am so glad that you're here with us tonight.
Thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be here and very pleased to be talking about one of my favorite topics, Paris fashion. So before we go into Paris fashion in the 1920s, I want to go back to 1900 because the changes that occurred in fashion between 1900 and the 1920s are so dramatic that it would be easy to assume that they've been caused by the First World War. Here, for example, we see an American socialite in about 1900 wearing a French couture gown. She's strictly corseted. She's dressed from neck to ankle. It's very much a look of propriety and a strict kind of respectable elegance. Now let's look at the next image. By the 1920s, you have women wearing clothes that are far looser. In place of corsets, they're wearing brassieres and perhaps a rubberized girdle. They're showing much more of their body, not just the décolletage, but arms and legs from the knees down. It's sometimes suggested that, oh, this was caused by World War I when there was a shortage of fabric, and so you had to have shorter dresses. This is not true. Nor is it true that all of the metal for corsets was used for weapons, and therefore there was nothing left for shaping the body. In fact, we find that the changes that we see in this period between 1900 and the 1920s actually began earlier, in the years before the war. We see the next image. Here we see a wonderful image from 1911. So 3 years before World War I began. And it's an image of an ensemble by the French couturier Paul Poiret, who once boasted that he had liberated women from the corset, introduced them to the brassiere. He certainly brought in the vogue for neoclassical dressing, and also, as you can see here, Orientalist fantasy dressing. He was an incredibly important figure because he brought in so many changes in dress that the dress reformers had been advocating for decades without much success at all. But when the suggestions came from the heart of the haute couture and the idea that you would be wearing daringly fashionable clothes, many more women were inclined to move towards this new style. In addition, and beyond the influence of a designer like Poiret or contemporaries like Madeleine Vionnet, there was a wider shift in the ideal of feminine beauty. So in place of a voluptuous, Juno-esque figure, a new ideal developed that was younger, slimmer, and more athletic. And this younger, slimmer ideal meant that women wanted to look different and were able to wear different clothes. And the more they exposed their bodies, the more they couldn't rely anymore on corsets. So you have a real shift in the aesthetic of what women wanted to look like. And aligned with that, a real change in the clothes that they were wearing. Oh. My office thinks that I've disappeared when I sit still for a while and the lights go off. Let's look at the next picture now. Here we have an image from about 1905 of the atelier of the famous couturier Jean Pacquiao. She was born Jean-Marie Charlotte Beckers in 1869. And by 1900, she was the president of the Chambre syndicale de la haute couture parisienne. So she was featured in the big international exhibition of 1900, and she was one of the most successful couturiers in Paris. Along with the House of Worth, she employed more than 1,000 different workers. And in a song from the pre-war period called The Revolutionary March of the Little Dressmakers, it began with the lyrics, "What does the little delivery girl demand of the House of Worth or of Pacquiao? More salary, less work." So here you see her surrounded by some of her clients in her beautiful showroom. And now in the next picture, we'll see another design by Pacquiao from about 6 years later. This is also from 1911. And you see here that Pacquiao also is advocating a sinuous line, not that straight front S-shaped corset. Instead, it looks like a brassiere. If there's any girdle at all, it's a soft rubberized girdle. In place of the pale frou-frou colors, the mauves and pale pinks and blues that were dominant in 1900, 1905, we have really vibrant colors, intense colors, which Paul Poiret described as being wild fauve colors, so different from the sweet girliness of fashion a few years earlier. Notice also that Pacquiao is using very avant-garde illustrators, and this too is part of the new image of fashion, which emerges before the war. Next picture. Now, interestingly, in this period between about 1900 or 1910 and 1940, you have primarily women couturiers. This is something we'll go into a little more later, but I'll just name some of them for you here. This is a dress made in 1920 by Jean Lanvin, a very important couturier ever since the 19-teens. This is one of her robes de style, which is a very romantic, historicizing look. She began as a very poor young woman who had to support all her brothers and sisters. She had an illegitimate daughter who she had to support, first as a hat maker, a milliner, then as a dressmaker. And she first made so many beautiful little clothes for her daughter that people started asking her to make clothes for them and their daughters. So this very much had a mother and daughter look that became part of her image. Next. This is another dress from the 20s by the Callot sisters. They too were famous right even earlier in the beginning part of the 20th century. There were several of them, Marie, Marthe, Regina, and Josephine, the daughters of a painter and a lace maker. Madeleine Vianney, who we'll meet in a minute, was their most famous protege. And she always said that without her apprenticeship with the Callot sisters, she never would have been able to create the beautiful clothes she did. She said that because of the Callots, she could make Rolls Royces instead of Fords, which was inadvertent, which was deliberately a kind of slap at Chanel, because of course the press said that Chanel's little black dress was like a fashion Ford. And Vianney, who we'll see in this next picture, Vianney was a great couturier who admired the Callots for dressing a body, not just making a design. And so Madeleine Vianney, arguably the greatest couturier of this period, was someone who's most famous today for having invented the bias cut. She didn't really invent it. It was used before, but she was the first to really employ it all over the dress, with the result that she created absolutely body-worshiping clothes, which were way in advance of anything else that was being done at the time, and which could literally be worn today. Next. There were many, many other women dressmakers as well. Here, for example, we see an image of a dress designed by Madame Jenny Sacerdote, who was described as a strictly modern woman who designed clothes that were characterized by this new spirit that we call modern. That she began to crash through the old routine of morning dress, afternoon dress, dinner gown, and evening gown with models devoted to sport, although this is clearly not a sports dress, but other modern styles. And this was very much something associated with these women designers. Next. Here, of course, we have one by Chanel, who was the most famous of the designers. Now, there were male designers too in the years between the First and Second World Wars, but the excitement lay with the, quote, regiment of women. In addition to Chanel, who was the most famous, there was Lanvin, Vianney, later by the 30s, Schiaparelli. There was Alix, known as Madame Gray, Augusta Bernard, the Callot sisters, Madame Chery, Sonia Delaunay, Nicole Groult, Poiret's sister, Jenny, Louise Boulanger, Lucille Paré, Madeleine Desroches, Jane Renier, Nina Ricci, and many, many others. Studies of women at this time, creative women, femmes créatrices, divide them into several categories. Those like Vianney, who rose through the ranks from being apprentice to having their own couture house. Those women who had a spectacular rise, like Chanel, and to some extent also Lanvin. Thirdly, society women who went into fashion either because they needed the money or because the fashion business, hitherto dominated by working class women, was now something that middle class women could also enjoy. And then, of course, the fourth category, women who played crucial artistic or technical roles behind the scenes. So they might be pattern makers, for example, or premieres at a couture house with someone else's name. And then, of course, a fifth category of milliners, because hats were such an important element in fashion. Next. Now, as I say, there were some men. Here you see, for example, a very stylish sportswear ensemble by Lucien Lelong. Jean Patou was another male designer. But as Patou told the press, it was more difficult then for men to make an impact than women. And this is a really fascinating thing, because he explained that men could also be designers. You didn't have to be a woman. And this was because at this time, there was so much emphasis on the idea of the modern woman, the new woman. And who better to dress the new woman than another new woman? It was hard for men to have that same kind of charismatic effect. And this, of course, Chanel worked to the hilt, because Chanel was not only the designer as new woman, but she was also her own best fashion model, as we'll see. Next. But first, let me show you a few things by a designer you've never heard of, Jane Renier. She was a well-known tennis player who specialized in fashions for sport. And the shopping guide of the day described her as an attractive young woman from a good family who, quote, saw the inevitable conquest of her world by the new idea of sports for women, of a freer life with different demands on couturiers. Next image. Here you see another image of the modern woman. This is an aviatrix's outfit designed by Madeleine Vianney and drawn by the illustrator Tayat in 1922. So women were driving cars, women were flying airplanes, women were playing sports, and they were increasingly working not just at traditional jobs like being seamstresses, but modern jobs being fashion designers. Next. Now, just to give you a little bit more of a sense of the look of the time, here is a photograph of Lanvin exhibition in 1925 for an exhibition of French art and luxury. And you can see how the very modern looking furniture and interiors, the modern mannequins, are also showing off a variety of different styles, some very body revealing, like the lounging woman, and others more decorative and pretty, because Lanvin really believed that prettiness and femininity didn't need to be discarded, even in an era with short hair and in many ways, a sort of androgynous style. Next image. Here you can see a close-up of a detail of that robe de style that was in the previous picture. You see the amazing embroidery work by the House of Lesage. Next. And here we see another Lanvin dress with the name Lesbos. Again, a hint to the sexual liberation of the 1920s. This is also 1925. And next, and yet another Lanvin dress with the name 1001 Nights, which was actually sort of copied from Paul Poiret Party, where he had everybody dress up in Orientalist costumes. Next. And here we have Lanvin in 1925, also doing very geometric, cubist-looking fashions with a wonderful modern illustration from yet another fashion magazine of the period. So we tend to think that Chanel was the one who sort of invented the modern fashion design and the modern woman, but there were many, many women doing this kind of thing. And Karl Lagerfeld once said, Lanvin was a great, great designer. But by the 1920s, she was a nice old lady, whereas Chanel was not so young herself by then, but who concealed her age and had romantic escapades, seemed much more charismatic and much more like the kind of woman that women wanted to look like. By the 30s, Lanvin was promoting her daughter as being the kind of ideal woman, because the daughter grew up and became married into the aristocracy. But Lanvin was also someone who had this rapid rise to extreme fame. And the house, of course, continues to exist, though not as a couture house anymore. Next. Because of the rise of skirts, shoes and stockings became increasingly important. And here we have some really beautiful shoes and decorative heels by the House of Perugia, which was known for its shoes and accessories. And next, here we have an interesting miniature dress done by Madeleine Vionnet. Vionnet was born in 1876, so 7 years before Chanel, and she died in 1975, 4 years after Chanel. So she's really right the same age. And Vionnet had none of Chanel's glamour. She looked like a governess, but she made dresses that made women look like goddesses. And she had a very interesting way of designing clothes. She made these tiny miniature dresses with a real fabric on dolls. And then she would ask friends of hers to come in and try on a life-sized dress. So let's look at the next picture. Try on a life-sized dress. And she chose women who had really good figures and who moved really well. She talked about how, she said, I was short and I hate short women. And she said, if I saw a woman who was ugly or short or fat, I would show her the door. I'd say, va-t'en, get out. But then she would bring in these lovely women like the Duchesse de Gramont. She said, she was a real model, tall and lovely. When I was designing a dress, I had only to ask her to come and try it on, and I knew exactly what was wrong. She emphasized that she had learned from the Callow sisters how to really create a dress that moved on the body. And because of that, she kind of dismissed Chanel, saying that, well, she was a milliner, she was a hat maker first. And then later she admitted, well, she's a very stylish woman, but she doesn't really know how to make the clothes. And Poiret, she just dismissed as being a costumier with his fantasy costumes. She wanted to make clothes that were really for beautiful women to move in. She also abolished the corset by about 1907, but of course she was able to do that because she only wanted to dress women who had perfect figures. We get the next picture. You can see again more detail, again by Lesage, in this beautiful dress. And the next image shows her in a more sporty mode looks totally modern. Hard to believe this is 1927, but actually she was even doing things like this in 1913 and 14. Very, very creative, body worshiping and body moving clothes that you could always move in her clothes. And she used many techniques that came from lingerie, so they were just incredibly elegant and fluid. Next. Now, Sonia Delaunay was another artist who also worked in fashion. Here we have one of her bathing suits. And in the next picture, you can see how bathing and sunbathing became very much a part of 20s sports life. And in contrast to 1900, when women would wear a long dress and stockings and shoes into the water, so they really couldn't swim, they just got wet. Here you have women wearing what were really seen as shockingly abbreviated clothes, and the idea of getting suntan became highly fashionable. So a complete shift in women's and men's lives, in part because after the war, people were so disgruntled with the older generation, which had led to such terrible massacres. More than 1 million Frenchmen were killed in World War I, and more than 1 million were mutilated, seriously wounded, blinded, or crippled by the war. So you had a world where people were disinclined to follow old rules. Next image. Part of the effect of the war included this increase in sort of androgynous or almost cross-dressing. There's a wonderful book called Civilization Without Sexes that takes its title from a diatribe by a man written in the 1920s, complaining that women had cut their hair short, they were wearing mannish clothes, they were smoking cigarettes, they were kissing and petting with men that they weren't married to or even engaged to. Because there were so many men who had died, bisexuality and lesbianism became much more common. And you have the women wearing very often the kind of man-like tailored suits, sometimes even monocles, white shirts, neckties, all of those looks. And yet, again, with the very short hair, the relatively flat bosom, and of course, the exposure of the legs, which was shocking because that was so juvenile. Only little girls and little boys would have exposed their legs before, not adults. Next. Now here we see a Chanel, and Chanel is, of course, one of the most fascinating figures of these creative women of the 1920s. She supposedly said, "L'élégance, c'est moi," elegance is me, unless the quotation is apocryphal, like so much else in her life. Growing up in terrible poverty, she wove over the course of her life such an elaborate tissue of lies about herself that one of her biographers actually asked, how old was she when she was 20? She was born in poverty in 1883. So by the 1920s, she was not a young woman anymore, but she was someone who continued to convey a look of youth and glamour. And her style was very much a personal style, in many ways based on the attire of her male protectors. So although her jacket was soft, she did tend to have jackets and skirts, or in the next picture, you'll see a kind of simple, often a black dress with a white collar. She told Salvador Dali, speaking of herself in the third person, she took the English masculine and made it feminine. All her life, all she did was change men's clothing into women's. Jackets, hair, neckties, wrists. Coco Chanel always dressed like the strong, independent male she had dreamed of being. She set women free because she had suffered too long from not being free herself, end quote. She was, of course, not any kind of a feminist. Hers was very much the style of the English gentleman or the dandy. In fact, she didn't invent the little black dress. Everybody had created little black dresses, both in the war years and in the 20s. But her insistence on Black clothing fit in with the dandyish style that Baudelaire had established in the previous century, that men's evening wear was Black, and that less was more in fashion. And she very much believed that. She replaced old-fashioned, ostentatious luxury with a much more austere style, a style that Poiret, of course, called poverty deluxe. And she said, Scheherazade, in other words, Orientalism is easy. A little Black dress is difficult. Next picture. This, however, is also by Chanel. And as a matter of fact, when I did my show on pink, I found so many pink dresses by Chanel, as well as this ravishing red feather cape, and the green dress that you saw. So it's a mistake to think that she only made Black dresses, but she was especially famous for those Black dresses. Let's see the next one. Here, for example, we see a really beautiful Chanel Black evening dress. And you can see how very austere. She also, though, would decorate it with elaborate jewels, whether those that were gifts from people like the Duke of Westminster, her lover, or the copies that she made, emphasizing that you didn't need to be adorning yourself with real jewels. It was all for the effect. And next, another really marvelous example by Chanel, a completely sequined a suit which took the masculine and made it feminine, a real dandy's Black suit. Chanel's friend Paul Morand wrote many years later, Chanel had only to appear in order to make the whole pre-war mode fade away, causing Worth and Pacquiao to wither and die. But that's a real exaggeration. Karl Lagerfeld, who did a lot of research into Chanel, even before he became the designer there, talked in interviews about how if you look at dresses from the 1920s, it's very difficult to tell which ones were made by Chanel as opposed to other designers, except in these sort of particular things. You can identify a Lanvin robe de style. But she epitomized the woman that everyone wanted to look like. And that, as much as any novelties in the clothing, made her such an impenetrable, such a powerful force in fashion. Let's see the next picture. You can see how this is the woman who, more than any other, in that period between Poiret's harem and Dior's new look, helped establish a new look for women. This particular picture is taken in 1932, and it's a little bit different than her 20s styles, but not that much. Chanel is a figure who is endlessly interesting. In the 20s, she said, eccentricity was dying. I hope to have had a part in killing it. And she professed to be nauseated by Poiret's brilliant colors, his electric blues and lemon yellows, and barbaric reds and greens. These colors are impossible, she said. Claimed they made her nauseated. And she brought in neutral colors like beige and black and navy blue, overwhelmingly colors associated with menswear. And in this way, she helped create this indelible image of herself. Next image. Here we look back again, and you can see how the Lanvin has some of that look of the 20s, but not the kind of hardcore modernism and dandyism, the mannishness, in a way, of Chanel. And now we'll look at one more, a man, as a little bit of a change. We have here a scene from Le Vertige, 1926, of a decorative and somewhat effeminate looking man who, as a matter of fact, the actor was gay. And you saw this as well, the androgyny of the period and the new sexual mores permitted much greater leeway, not only to cross-dressing, but also to homosexuality and to premarital sexuality. and extramarital sexuality. And this was something that we saw, of course, not only in Paris, but throughout the Western world. In the United States, also, you remember Zelda Fitzgerald boasted that she wanted to kiss so many men before she got married. And finally, let's go back to this last picture here. This is a beautiful example of Madeleine Vianney's incredible body worshiping style. So you have here several different variants of the 20s woman. You have the sort of androgynous dandy that Chanel promoted. And then you had the pretty but modern woman that Lanvin was promoting. You had the sports look that was promoted by people from Jean Reni to Jean Patou, to of course Chanel as well. And then you had real body worshiping clothes, especially important with Madeleine Vianney, clothes that were meant to move and to move with the body, that were meant to show off the beauty of the body, a body that was liberated from corsets, but of course, in a sense, had internalized the corset. So you had to now make your body itself beautiful. You couldn't rely on a corset anymore to push the fat around and to create a false figure underneath the covered up dress. So in this way, you have a series of different styles in the 1920s that evoke the tremendous changes going on in women's lives, in society in general. You see female fashion designers creating fashions in the various images of the new woman. And you see that although Coco Chanel was the most famous couturier of the 1920s, she was hardly alone. Indeed, a regiment of women dominated the fashion system in the years between Poiret's harem and Dior's new look. The 20s is such an exciting period of time to study because of the vivacity of social and cultural life and the striking emergence of independent women who were sort of becoming really the leaders of fashion in a way that they remained right up until 1939, when the Nazis occupied Paris. And then when fashion really began again after the war, things had changed, and it was the era of male designers. Christian Dior, of course, but also Cristobal Balenciaga, Jacques Fath, a host of others. Fath once said, "The only role for a woman in fashion is wearing clothes. Fashion is an art, and men are the artists." But people who had lived through the 20s and 30s said, "Oh no, what about Chanel? What about Vianney and Lanvin? They were great, great women designers, but they had temporarily faded away, gone out of business. Only two reemerged in force. Chanel, who came back eventually in 1954 and reopened her house at the age of 71, and then Madame Grey, who had begun in the 1930s and who kept her house open throughout the war and afterwards. But that leads us into a whole nother series of issues. It was, I think, perhaps happier to rest on the 20s in this great early moment of women's freedom and fashion power. So at this point, I am happy to take questions from the audience.
Thank you, Valerie. Before I end screen share so we can see you a little bit better, one of the first questions we got was about the shoes.
Oh, yes.
Featured. And it looked,
Oh, there it is. You just missed
overshot.
Went ahead.
Are those interchangeable heels? Could the different heels be added to the same shoe body?
What's the question, Erin?
It's sorry. The question is, Are the heels that are displayed at the bottom there, are those interchangeable? Could you add those and swap them out for the same
Yes.
pair?
Yes, you could. And you notice the decoration, all the sparkliness has a lot to do with dancing and going out at night. So just as, 18th century people would wear their diamonds, here you have all of these sort of rhinestone decorations. And dancing was a huge impact on fashion. Not just on these shoes, but on dresses as well. They often had fringe, which would move when you danced. So there were caricatures of flappers with the fringe moving and the skirts flying up and the top of the stockings being visible. So it was very much the whole emphasis on the legs and therefore on shoes and stockings became incredibly important. It started before the war. You started to have Paul Poiret had dresses that were slit up to the knee, which was scandalous. And he also experimented with putting women in Turkish trousers. Pacquiao was more conservative. She had dresses that were slit to the knee to make it easier to walk, but then they were filled in with, chiffon on the side. So you could have that straight hobble skirt look, but actually be able to move comfortably.
That is fabulous. I think that your point about the influence of dancing in fashion translates nicely to another question we got, which is, how did the influx of African American artists, performers, members of the military, and the explosion of jazz clubs how did that impact French fashion?
Enormously, enormously. I mean, the 20s is the jazz age. And for all that Paris was the capital of fashion, the French were madly in love with jazz, with American dance, and enthralled with the African Americans who were appearing there, many of them performing there. Josephine Baker she had fabulous stage costumes, but she was also a major client of the couture. People like Poiret and others really wanted to dress her because she was so glamorous. So that's a very important aspect of it. And the new dances that came in, things like the Charleston, were very often African American dances. So the music and the dance styles owed a great deal to African American music culture.
Vanessa asked along the similar lines, what influence films and movies had on fashion in the 20s?
They had an influence in as much as even if you lived in a little town in, Illinois or in some obscure little French village, you could see all of the images of stylish people. And so you were, in a sense, you could envision yourself wearing these. And then too, because the clothes were so much simpler to make, they were really just little sheath dresses. You didn't have to have a couturier or a little dressmaker make it for you. You could run down to the department store or send away for it from a catalog from a department store and get an inexpensive and quite decent copy of a fashionable dress. And so the democratization of fashion picked up in a big way in the 1920s. And that vision of it came through in the films. What's interesting is that not many couturiers successfully made it into creating fashion for film, because costumes for film really serve different functions to enhance a character, to help create a character. And they're also made in advance. So one of the big Hollywood moguls brought Chanel to Hollywood at great expense, paying her a fortune, but later complained that her clothes were too discreet. They weren't sort of va-va-va-voom enough for a Hollywood star, that you needed to take it up quite a couple of notches to look like that glamorous on screen.
Jeffrey Hirsch and Caroline Radis both asked questions that I think are in a similar vein about the change in undergarments. Jeff shared that the idea of a rubberized girdle sounds quite terrible. And Caroline asked if folks were wearing anything to help kind of flatten out a fuller figure.
Right. Okay, that's a good question. When you get that first image from 1900, you're wearing a boned corset with whalebone or metal boning that pushed your stomach in and caused a kind of back curves, like an S curve. With Poiret and others like Vianney, you bring in a straight up and down figure, which is high waisted. And so therefore you can wear a kind of brassiere. And then underneath that, if you're slim enough, you don't need a boned corset. And if you're not, yeah, you still wore a long, tight corset. But if you were skinnier, you might just wear a short little girdle. I mean, maybe rubberized sounds too horrible, but the point is it's not boned. It's a stretchy material, and it could be quite light. If you were skinny enough, it could be hardly anything. One of the big influences was another dance, the tango, because when you do a tango, you bend over backwards, and you can't bend in a boned corset. And so women were either took off their corsets in the ladies' room and went dancing without them, which didn't really work because the dress didn't fit right, or they started wearing no corset or just a little stretchable girdle, and so they could move. And this tango corset was immensely influential, because then the idea was you might still wear some kind of little girdle, but it was no longer supposed to be boned. As for the brassieres, most of them were just like a bandeau. They weren't emphasizing a monobosom like before, but nor were they separating them out much. If there was a tendency to emphasize a small breast, so if you had large breasts, you might wear a somewhat slightly flattening bandeau, which can't have been very comfortable. But already it's really the idea was again, not to have the sort of Juno-esque or Venus-like figure, but to be more like Diana, the virgin goddess of the hunt and of sports, to be younger, slimmer, more active. And it began to seem that only women who were elderly or overweight needed to wear corsets. So there's a very funny series of interviews I read in a French fashion magazine in 1903, where all these famous actresses are asked, who's your favorite couturier? Who's your favorite milliner? Who's your favorite corsetier? And half of these ladies said, I don't need to wear a corset. And you look at their photographs in the magazine in 1903 and you go, babe, you are so wearing a corset. I can see the lines of it. But it had already started to seem like you shouldn't need to have to wear one. So that feeling really grew over the years, and the sense that it wasn't shocking to have your body be moving. That was good.
Interesting. Holly asked if you can talk a little bit about the fabrics that were used. And in particular, she was curious to hear about knits.
Knits. There are some very nice knits that were made in the 1920s. We have a beautiful sort of matching sweater and skirt set with a sort of cubist print on it that was made in Paris in the 20s. Other materials were silks or artificial silks that became popular. In general, things that were lightweight and movable. Although, of course, you also had wool dresses and suits as well. But the main idea was that they were looser and lighter. And this was something that ultimately started to get some men jealous. The men's dress reform party in Great Britain in the late 1920s started to say, women's clothes have advanced so much over the past 20 years, but men's clothes are all the same. We need to also start having looser, lighter clothes the way women have.
Like the business shorts trend that there were a couple of stories about in the Times a few years ago.
That's right. And they experimented with that in 1929 too for men. And everybody laughed at them because, again, only juvenile boys like Boy Scouts wore shorts. It wasn't for grown-ups. And people may also thought it looked effeminate because women were showing off their legs. And so why were men doing it?
Interesting. Michael asked a question about how some of these styles translated to the less rich women and to more accessible designers. And I think you spoke to that a little bit when you talked about, the ease of a shift dress and being able to reproduce that.
Yes, but even the decoration, I mean, obviously Lesage workmanship is incredible, but you can have machine embroidery. And so if stores, for example, in Providence, Rhode Island, you could ship in strips of embroidery that were sort of mass produced in France, and then make a little dress for someone and sew that on the hem, and then have the tassels and swirling embroidery and everything that was sort of pre-packaged for you to put into your inexpensive dress made by a little dressmaker or a department store in the US.
How fabulous.
And we, of course, there were tons of counterfeits as well. We actually bought for the museum a terrible counterfeit V&A, which was just the worst copy of that little horse's dress that I showed on the little mannequin. Such a famous one with the Lesage embroidery is gorgeous. The one we bought, it was just embarrassingly bad, but somebody made it and sold it, and it looked enough like the V&A that somebody bought it.
I love the idea of 1920s fast fashion and maybe it's not exactly like the one you saw on that red carpet. We've all been there. Kathy asked if you could talk a little bit about the role of hand fans.
Hand fans. Well, they continue to play a role, but much less of one than they had in earlier generations. In 1900, you have lots of, big ostrich feather fans and sort of glamorous big fans. In the 1910s, you often have smaller, more sort of Empire style neoclassical fans. And you also start to have, by the 1910s, paper fans that are often advertising fans, like the shape of the Pacquiao advertisement, that's shaped like a fan, and you could have bought a fan like that. The thing is that in the 20s, the accessory that largely replaced the fan was the cigarette. So instead of playing with your fan, you played with your cigarette and your cigarette holder and your lighter and so on.
Interesting. I like that your office thinks you should be at home resting.
Yeah. Okay. But I'm sitting here so still that I'm no longer here.
Stephanie asked about clothing and hats with labels that read adaptations from design houses, and asked if a little bit about the authorized reproduction, and that, which is a very different world than we inhabit today.
Yeah, there were a lot of authorized adaptations. So milliners were a huge category of fashion creators in Paris. And there were a lot of famous milliners. They'd already started licensing adaptations and copies by the 19th century. And the prestige of France was such that a lot of American dressmakers and milliners used French names. But you could also license the rights to copy or adapt a particular dress or a hat.
Susan asked a great question about where the couture workshops were. Did the shop tend to be right behind the storefront? Were those concentrated in any one particular area of Paris?
That's a great question. With the big couture houses, so the Pacquiao and the V&As and so on, yes, it was one building, and you had the places where the ladies came to try on clothes and to be fitted, and then on other floors you had the actual ateliers, which tended to be divided into the tailoring atelier and then the fluid soft dressmaking atelier. So there were a lot of specialization there. There were, of course, many more small couturiers where things were more cramped and crowded, and the term couturier just means you're a sewer, so you're a dressmaker. Hence the term grande couturier, which later became haute couture, big couture or high couture, to explain that you were sort of creating a form of art. The haute couturiers tended to be in places like Rue de la Paix, in the central right bank, Paris. And even today, you'll find certain neighborhoods which are associated with the big luxury stores. And you'll find the sort of headquarters of Dior, for example, will still be there. That tended to be the way it went. But there were other neighborhoods like the Marais that were famous for other kinds of cheaper clothing production and sort of little shops, the knockoff shops that would make adaptations or frankly just ripoffs of licensed things. V&A just was crazy about, she couldn't stand everybody ripping her off because she was so innovative, everybody did. So she photographed every dress that she did from different angles and registered them with the police. And each of her labels had not just her name, but her thumbprint on it. So she made a major effort to try and fight piracy, but it was very, very difficult.
I would love to learn more about, cases of how that was pursued and prosecuted and whether she was successful in that that pursuit.
Yes, I haven't read very much about that. In general, one gets the impression that there was so much of it going on that she might win occasionally, but
it wouldn't really make much of a difference. Chris Colby asked if you could help us understand a little bit about the cost of a haute couture dress.
Oh, so much cheaper than now. I mean, not just in terms of dollars, but in terms of equivalent amounts of money. I mean, if today an haute couture evening gown from Chanel might be $100,000 and a suit, might be $50,000. In today's money, back then it would have been a tiny fraction of that. I mean, 10%, 10%.
Not just inflation, it is also
it was just
increase in status
much less expensive to make it. Of course, that partly had to do with the fact that most of the workers were rather poorly paid. Only a few couturiers, Madeleine V&A, because she'd worked her way up, she started working when she was 11 as an apprentice. She was taken out of school. She wanted to be a teacher and she was sent off to be an apprentice. And she really made a point of giving all of her workers, pregnancy leaves, vacation time. They had childcare facilities. They had cafeterias where they could eat inexpensively. But that was really the exception. One woman who had worked for Chanel and then went to work for V&A, when she got there, she was so stunned by it. She said, am I working in the Ritz? It's like, it's so fancy here. It's like, it's such a nice setup.
That's fabulous. And something that we see now as still something that companies are doing in order to woo perhaps top talent. From Chanel to V&A.
Yes, well, some of the big houses, couture houses now, are making a point of trying to really make sure the workers are well paid, because otherwise they'll just lose them. The skill, for example, in doing the embroidery is disappearing fast.
That makes sense. Jennifer asked for a little bit more information on Jane Evenet.
Jane Renier?
Renier, yes. Okay. And part of it was, can you help me spell the last name so I can go learn more?
Yes, it is R as in radio, E with an accent going up, G-N-Y. There's very little that seems to have been published about her. When I did my book, Women of Fashion, I found a few sources from the period that talked about her, but not very much. So I think to find out more, you'd really have to go into primary sources and start looking through, books and magazines. I found some things, and they were advice books for shoppers. For example, Americans who were going to shop in Paris got information about different designers. And some of the magazines also talked about her. They also talked about, she was one of the first to realize the difference between sport clothes that can be comfortably and appropriately worn by the participant and those that can be worn by the spectator. And again, that came because of her having been a successful tennis player before she went into opening a couture house that specialized in sports dressing.
I love that. The 1920s we can thank for our athleisure as well. Well, I think that we've gotten to most of the questions in the queue, but one question that came in early. Oh, that's a good one too. We'll add that too. Okay. One question was, yes, if you have good questions, keep sending them. But someone asked where we can still see some of these beautiful outfits. And I assume that many of these are objects that are photographed and in several of your publications. Are any of them on view at MFIT right now?
I don't think that, well, there might be one 1920s dress on display in our big exhibition, Ravishing the Rose in Fashion. 20s dresses, of course, are very fragile, and as with most fashion. And so really it should only be on display for a maximum of 3 or 4 months. So that's why clothing exhibitions change and are relatively short. They're like drawings or watercolors which can fade in the light. The silks can shatter. They can start to disintegrate on the mannequin. So sometimes some of the dresses even have to be shown flat on an inclined board rather than on a clothed mannequin. So we don't have much showing now. We may have something maybe on display in our show on Head to Toe that opens next month, which looks at accessories, but also, of course, at the dresses that go with accessories. I think you just have to keep going to as many fashion exhibitions as you can, and you'll see, a few 20s dresses. Well, in your show, you'll see tons of wonderful 20s dresses. But it's like a dance performance. I think maybe that's part of the beauty of fashion exhibitions. You see that beauty, but you realize you can't just go back and see it any old time you want.
I love that. I love that. Well, the last question I will pose to you is what we know about what women of color were wearing during these times. Was it the same? How was it different?
Largely the same. The fashionable women in New York and Washington, D.C., like the fashionable women in Paris, were wearing clothes that either came from couturiers or were adaptations by some of these top couturiers. And they could also be made by really skilled dressmakers. And there's a long history of that within the African American community of having very skilled dressmakers who were able to create for themselves or for favored clients really beautiful clothes. So if you look at photographs taken in Harlem in the 1920s, it's a fashion parade. I mean, you just see the most gorgeous, stylish clothes on both men and women. We kind of skipped the men for this because Paris was more about women's wear, but men also were very, very well dressed and dressed in a way which was gradually becoming more casual and lightly inflected by sportswear. So the jackets were looser, not as formal, they were shorter, etc. It was moving too slowly for the Men's Dress Reform Society, but it was moving in the direction they wanted. So yes, I think that the role of fashion in the African American community and in the sort of African diaspora in general is one that was very strong and very important. And lots of trends we're set in that community, and certainly lots of fashion forward individuals.
Well, Valerie, this has been an absolute delight. We've already gotten comments in the chats talking about how much folks have enjoyed you and how much they're looking forward to your next lecture at Hillwood. And I agree. I was very surprised when I was looking back over records to realize it had been so long since 2015. And I look forward to the next time that we can have you, hopefully in person.
Thank you so much. I look forward to it too.
Thank you to everyone who spent their evening with us tonight. Really glad to be with you all month long with a great exploration for the exhibition. If you have not seen it yet or have not seen it recently, please do come back. The show is on view until January 9th, and the fall gardens are amazing right now. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much. I look forward to seeing the show in November.